Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Redman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's webinar. This is a project, an event we've actually been talking about for quite a bit of time, and really pleased to be able to put it together for this afternoon. Before we start, I just wanted to take a moment or two to kind of frame exactly why we're doing this event and how it connects to a larger initiative we have underway here in the Mexico Institute called Engendering Safety, Addressing Femicide in Mexico. I had the opportunity about 6 months ago on a trip to Denver to see the exhibit that we're going to talk about today, Traitor survivor icon La Malinche. And I really found it to be an incredibly moving and impactful exhibit. Like many who had studied Mexican history, I knew the story of La Malinche, but I knew it really from one male European perspective, and didn't have the opportunity to think about it in a different way. And when I heard that the exhibit wouldn't be traveling east, wouldn't be out here in DC or on the East Coast, I thought, well, how do we spread the message more broadly? Happily, and through an introduction from the team at the Denver Biennial, we were connected to Victoria Lyle and Teresita Romo, and they've joined us this afternoon, and they'll be kind enough, or were kind enough, to work with us to develop a virtual tour, if you will, of the exhibit, and they'll tell you more about that shortly. But today's program is more than just a virtual tour, though that alone would be really great. As I alluded to, it links directly to our broader initiative. So following the tour, if you will, of the exhibit, our panelists, moderated by Mexico Institute Global Fellow Gema Clope Santa Maria, will discuss the link between how women are seen and see themselves and femicide. And that, at the end of the day, is really the point of today's program, to explore how this changing interpretation of La Malinche and of Mexican women more broadly can impact efforts to reduce, if not eradicate, femicide. So now I'm happy to turn things over to Victoria Lyle, the Jan and Frederick Mayer Curator of Art of the Ancient Americas at the Denver Art Museum, and Teresita Romo, lecturer and affiliate faculty in the Chicano Studies Department at the University of California at Davis. Victoria and Teresita, thank you again so much for doing this with us today, and we're all looking forward to the program. So with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I am delighted to be with all of you here today. Buenas tardes. It's such a pleasure to be part of this panel and to share with you this project that has been such a labor of love for me for the past 6 years, and for Tere for much longer. I want to acknowledge that we were very fortunate in receiving funding for both the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Furthermore Foundation, without whom the loans in the catalog for this exhibition would not have been possible. In addition, we are very, very grateful to our counterparts in Mexico, to the many friends and colleagues and scholars that made many of these loans possible, but particularly to Mexico's Secretary of Culture and the National Institute for Anthropology and History, who were invaluable in helping us finalize the loan of several masterpieces from their collections. Artist Annie Lopez describes Malinche in 8 words: sold as a slave, interpreter, companion, survivor. This succinct description captures the basic outlines of a girl's life, a girl we have come to know as Malinche. For 500 years, she has entranced us. Rarely has any historical figure, let alone a woman, an indigenous woman, had so much influence. Both revered and reviled, Malinche's name engendered a slur, Malinchista, someone who prefers foreigners to their own. This is the first exhibition of its kind in the United States or in Mexico. 6 years ago, Tere shared with me this project, an idea that had evolved from an essay she'd written titled Malinche's Metaphor. And the exhibition continues to follow the basic structure Tere devised so many years ago. It explores 5 concepts for which Malinche has served as a metaphor: lengua or interpreter, indígena or indigenous woman, madre de mestizaje or mother of a mixed race, traidora or traitor, and finally, chicana. The works on display span 5 centuries, but they are not arranged chronologically. The juxtapositions that you'll see in our tour hopefully make visible the pervasiveness of these concepts and the many ways that these ideas continue to shape our understanding of Malinche and her role in historical events. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-curator, Teresita Romo.
Thank you, Victoria. And thank you, everyone at the Wilson Center for inviting me to be part of this program, supporting your very important and timely initiative. I also want to acknowledge that I'm here on the ancestral lands of the Maidu and the Wintu peoples. Though I began my research into Malinche 2 decades ago, the seeds were planted during my childhood. As a member of an immigrant family, I grew up with an image of La Malinche that had been cut out from a Mexican calendar and framed. Proudly displayed in our living room, Malinche was depicted confronting the viewer alongside a downcast Cortés in Jesús Helguera's painting La Noche Triste. While I was too young to recognize her features as primarily European, her forceful gaze, dark skin, and the huipil she wore exuded indigenous pride. For me, this idealized portrait of the couple not only reflected our proud connections to Mexico and its history, but also explained our family's spectrum of eye, hair, and skin colors. Thus, unlike many Mexicanos, I saw Malinche as a positive figure. It was while in college during the Chicano movement of the 1970s that I became aware of Malinche as, quote, a traitor based on her role as Cortés's interpreter and, quote, mistress during the conquest. Along with reading Octavio Paz's essay, Los Hijos de la Malinche, I was exposed to Chicanas being called Malinches as well. Years later, as a curator, I decided to explore that disconnect between my and other Chicanas' nuanced relationship with Malinche and her negative personifications within Mexican history. The exhibition would interrogate the labels and confront the issues of race and gender politics within predominantly male narratives and depictions of Malinche, as well as her reclamation by Chicana artists. I'm indebted to the writings and artwork of the early Chicana poets, scholars, and visual artists who provided her with a voice and a presence. They, and those who followed, restored her humanity, exposing the complexity of Malinche's life as an enslaved, teenaged indigenous woman. With our exhibition, Victoria and I added our contributions to a reevaluation of Malinche within an evolving framework of her contemporary relevance. It is our hope that it generates greater interest and research, especially among young people, along with more dialogue and critical thinking about her legacy on both sides of the border. And now we would like to take you through our exhibition.
Sorry about that. Our opening slide, you'll see we will be opening the 3rd venue of this Malinche exhibition on the tour, San Antonio Museum of Art, in 2 weeks. So I hope some of you who have not already seen the show will be able to travel to San Antonio Museum of Art to see this exhibition, which will be up until January 8. In 1521, there we go. In 1521, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, fell to Spanish invaders, toppling one of the most powerful indigenous governments in the Americas. Centuries later, the repercussions of that moment continue to be felt. For some, the conquest is not over. During this historic moment, a young Nahuatl girl between 11 and 16 stood center stage, a translator of languages and cultural interpreter for two worlds, Indigenous and European. We know her by many names, Marina, Malintzin, and Malinche. There's no record of her in her own voice. Her story survives through the writing and the images of those who knew her, admired her, or criticized her. Traitor Survivor Icon is the first comprehensive exploration of Malinche's enduring image and legacy. Malinche first appeared in a painted 16th century document. Here we have, these are some of the earliest known images of Malinche from one of the copies of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, an indigenous woman pictured as Cortez's equal. I don't know if my cursor can be seen, but if you see the road of horse prints, she is the woman in red standing just under the black clad figure who represents Cortez. Both the image and text reflect an indigenous perspective. Malinche stands alongside Cortez, well-dressed and gesturing with as much power and status as him. If you look very closely, you'll see she is as large as he is. However, her first mention, which appears in Nahuatl, also subtly acknowledges her traumatic past, her position as a captured slave. She was acknowledged as one of us people here, but in fact, the verb that was used has an undertone of capture and not just taken.
As Victoria mentioned in her introduction, without a record of her voice, over the course of 500 years, Malinche has become a metaphor, symbolizing attributes related to race, gender, and class that have historically served predominantly male agendas. The exhibition is organized around 5 distinct archetypes, metaphors embodied by Malinche. As you can see here, la lengua, la indígena, la madre de mestizaje, la traidora, and Chicana, contemporary reclamations. Most visitors may not know who Malinche was, so we begin with a timeline. From right to left, it includes the major historical moments from 1521 to 2021 and serves to situate the viewer within a specific historical time frame. 2 artworks share space with the timeline. Armando Baeza's open arms sculpture of Malinche welcomes you into the space. Sandy Rodriguez's Mapa de Malinche and Our Stolen Sisters brings the story into the present day.
Often when we speak of, quote, the conquest of the Americas, or the Spanish and Aztec War, as it sometimes is called, we include a map of Cortez's expeditions, where he landed, the route he took from coast inland. And for her commission, Sandy Rodriguez chose to subvert the idea of Cortez's map and instead focus on Malinche and her life's journey, with 8 pivotal moments from her birth to death. So on the screen, what you see is Sandy's map. It consists of 2 pieces of amate paper, painted with Malinche's life journey as a continuous narrative on the right-hand side. And then you see the US-Mexico border very visible across both of the upper portions of the map. Rodriguez's map of Mexico and the southern US makes visible Malinche's life from birth on the coast of Coatzacoalcos, being sold into slavery, and here you see her with a yoke around her neck. Her journey with the Spanish and the horrors that she witnessed during those periods, including the burning of the Templo Mayor, the massacre of Cholula, the birth of Martin, her son, by Cortés, her marriage to Juan Jaramillo, which is pictured, she's standing with a white manta, holding the arm of a Spanish soldier above the burning temple of the Templo Mayor. The journey to Guatemala and Honduras, during which she gives birth to Maria, and you see that in the far right corner. And finally, her death, pictured here as a mummy bundle being burned. As with all of her pieces, Rodriguez considered what is the connection between this story to today, the present moment. We know that Malinche was gifted to the Spanish along with 19 other women. The fates of those women, however, remains unknown. To Rodriguez, this speaks to an enduring legacy of violence against Indigenous female bodies. And she worked with Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Foundation to locate places where 19 Indigenous women disappeared or were murdered in the year 2021. Red hands painted across the map identify these sites and underscore the enduring legacy of colonial violence today. And so here you see Malinche with her yoke of a slave, and underneath is a red handprint that's circled.
The first section, La Lengua, that you see here, the interpreter, foregrounds Malinche's linguistic gifts and knowledge of the Nahuatl language and courtly customs, which secured her a position within Cortés's campaign to conquer the Aztecs and claim the land for Spain. This section also calls to attention how she is described for the first time in Cortés's second letter to King Charles V, not by her name, but as La Lengua que yo tengo, my tongue, denoting her primary function as his interpreter, as well as her status as a slave. Jesusa Rodriguez's video on the left, in which she is dressed as Malinche, is the only piece that provides Malinche an audible voice. Portraying Malinche, Rodriguez recounts the arrival of Cortés and his entourage to Tenochtitlan. Created in 1986, her monologue, which is a tour de force of words played, Chilango slang, and double entendre, draws a connection between the impact of Spanish colonization and El PRI's corruption of the Mexican nation. This section also includes Robert Vitron's black and white photograph depicting an imagined scene between Malinche and Pocahontas, who is on the left, an indigenous woman who mediated between her people and the Englishman John Smith at Jamestown. Here, Vitron places them in front of power books from the 1990s. With their animated conversation and typing, the two women are portrayed as actively taking control of their own narrative.
Though the works on display span 5 centuries, Tere and I deliberately decided not to arrange them in a chronological order. Thus, Jesusa Rodriguez's video and Robert Vitron's photograph from the 20th centuries, both of them are juxtaposed alongside what you see here, which are 19th century copies of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala that feature Malinche as a protagonist, the same size or bigger than Cortés and occupying way more space on the page. It also records the point of view of the Tlaxcaltecas, indigenous warriors who allied themselves with the Spanish, thinking that they would be able to overthrow the Aztec Empire and rule independently. So at this time in the 16th century, what we've come to know as the Aztecs controlled a large portion of what is today central Mexico. There were a few communities, Alteberals, that were able to remain independent, Tlaxcala being one of them. And really their hope was to be able to stave off any further encroachment into their territory. The Lienzo and its many copies pled the Tlaxcalans' case for compensation to the Spanish monarchy over the next 3 centuries. So in a way, we thought that this was an interesting conversation between the Tlaxcaltecas and of course Jesusa's criticism of the pre-government. The title of the next section, Mujer Indígena, or Indigenous Woman, is also taken from a line in Cortez's second letter to King Charles V. He describes her as, quote, una india de esta tierra, an Indian woman from this land. This racial and ethnic designation becomes a central aspect of Malinche's biography. This section explores how Indigenous women in the 16th century define themselves and how in subsequent centuries, indigeneity was portrayed by others in exotic or sexualized representations, both in film and in print. The 3 ancient sculptures that you see here depict the fashion and posture of a Central Mexican woman before the Spanish arrived. Hairstyle communicated your status, were you married or unmarried, and your jewelry and the fineness of the cloth that you wore signaled your wealth and status to those around you. Ramos Martinez's luminous portrait of a woman from Yaglala, a Oaxacan city on the Isthmus, portrays Malinche with beauty and dignity and underscores her indigeneity, her brown skin and woven hair. The contemporary huipil that you see on the far left was designed in collaboration between Carla Fernandez, Mexican fashion designer, Feliciana Batista, a Purépecha weaver, and Maria Rosa Bartola, an Otomi embroiderer. This imagines, the 3 artists collaborated to imagine what a Nueva Malinche would be wearing for the 21st century. The fringe that you can see on the epaulettes and also along the hem has a double entendre. It both reads as a feather, which is a reference to rapacejo, a technique that's very common in Michoacán where Feliciana lives, but also can be read as a tongue. The embroidered rectangle in the center by Maria Rosa is her portrait of Malinche. It's done in a technique called pepenado, which is very unique to San Juan Ixtenco in Tlaxcala. And according to Maria Rosa, Malinche is their heroine. She is the one who brought this technique to Tlaxcala.
One can see the sexualization that Victoria referred to of Indigenous women portrayed in Jesus Helguera's 1941 painting that was reproduced on the calendar next to it. The most well-known of the Mexican calendar painters, Helguera immortalized a nostalgic view of Mexico, including its pre-conquest past. In his painting, he has created a romantic, quote, love story interaction between Cortés and Malinche, who's depicted with her fair skin and European features. These depictions contributed to and popularized perceptions of Malinche as a willing seductress and traitor who put her sexual desires over her people. Next. While the exhibition, as Victoria has said, is not organized chronologically, we know that Malinche's visibility surges during certain historical moments. The late 19th and early 20th century is one of these. Ravished by a century of civil war, the Mexican nation needed a narrative that would unite the country once again. It promoted Cortés and Malinche as the Mexican Adam and Eve, the founding couple of a new cosmic race, uniting Europe and, quote, the New World. Their son, Martín, was proclaimed as the first mestizo or mixed race child. Examples of this are featured in La Madre de Mestizaje section, including the cubist portrait of Malinche and Cortés by Jorge Camarena, a student of Mexico's Los Tres Grandes, which you can see in the center. Although some saw this union as the future of Mexico, for many, this was also seen as another betrayal by Malinche. Artworks by artists John Valadez and Maria Cristina are also included in this section, and they challenge the romantic notions of racial unions that constituted the ideals of mestizaje. Valadez's monumental pastel deliberately provokes a feeling of discomfort from the choices of color, the myriad patterns, and the subject matter of the composition. Valadez asks the viewer to consider ulterior motives, what ulterior motives may exist for the union. In the depiction of an older white man embracing a much younger brown woman, aspects of the unequal racial and class power relations emerge. With his inclusion of José Clemente Orozco's mural of Cortés y Malinche, he draws direct connections to Malinche's precarious situation as an indigenous woman in her relationship with Cortés, who's pictured with his arm pushing her back in the mural, as is the man in the painting, in Valdez's painting. Tavera's print takes its imagery from Valle de Lágrimas, the popular soap opera magazine of the 1960s and 70s. Here, Helguera's image from the painting La Noche Triste is surrounded by vignettes depicting contemporary domestic violence and family trauma. For Tavera, these reflect the destructive effects of violence against women reaching back centuries. Her print is also questioning the sanitized, quote, conquista of Malinche within the romantic portrayals of the racial union.
Here you see a large reproduction of José Clemente Orozco's mural, as quoted in John Valadez's painting. The La Traidora section explores the multiple types of perceived betrayals, sexual, racial, and spiritual, that came to dominate Mexican understandings of Malinche during the second half of the 20th century, and many of these persist today. The artworks examine how representations of past historical events came to influence and embody negative contemporary cultural and political sentiment towards her, and how this viewpoint crossed the border into the United States and took hold within the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. The labels of seductress, temptress, traitor are continually associated with Malinche. However, they imply age and agency in a moment when her life really wasn't her own. Malinche was a teenager, an enslaved woman who had to make choices and navigate the confines of her existence. And a way of considering this ambiguity or this tension, we decided to open this fourth section of the exhibition with Antonio Ruiz's Sueño de Malinche, which you see here on the right-hand side. This very small painting, this miniature painting, shows Malinche on her side sleeping, and her hip has grown into the town of Cholula. So it's very difficult to see here, but at the very apex of her hip is the Church of La Virgen de los Remedios. Ruiz paints this just after hearing a lecture by Ignacio Marquina, noted archaeologist and architect in Mexico, who was the first person to excavate what we now know as the Pyramid of Cholula, the largest known pre-Hispanic pyramid in the Americas. So what's really incredible here is that you see Malinche in this room with the bricks showing through the painting, there are cracks in the ceiling. It clearly demonstrates that Ruiz is having this really conflicted sentiment about Malinche. And in the background, you can see that there are two colonial paintings. The one on the right was painted around 1630, and you can see it shows the baptism of the lords of Tlaxcala with Malinche and Cortés as the godparents. It's done for what was then the convent in Tlaxcala, so a place where most of the inhabitants were in fact criollos. So if you notice, Malinche is very fair-skinned. On the left-hand side, you see a copy of this painting done about 70 years later, around 1700, but it's done for the church in the center of town, a very different populace and a very different congregation. Notice that Malinche, again, standing just behind Cortez as the godmother of the Lord of Tlaxcala who's being baptized, is much more brown-skinned. And in some ways, this pairing, I think, epitomizes what we were trying to say in the show. Different audience, different Malinche.
This view of Malinche as traitor became increasingly popular both in Mexico and in the US in the 1950s, due in large part to Paz's infamous essay, Los Hijos de la Malinche. Several works in the traitor section showcase how these negative views abounded in artworks at the time, as well as within the artwork of contemporary Chicano artists. On the left is David Avalos's piece called Combination Plate Number 3, The Straight Razor Taco. It references Malinche, but Avalos strives to present a more complicated interpretation of her betrayal, citing the unresolved trauma of mestizaje as a source of terror, yet fascination. Nevertheless, the installation features aggressive imagery, alluding to female seduction and castration. On the right is Cesar Martinez's painting, Toreando el Toro de Picasso, with La Malinche as Carmen watching, which also considers her perceived role as the calculating seducer. Here, Malinche is portrayed as the free-spirited yet ill-fated woman who, like the opera Carmen, could not overcome the events she set in motion with her perceived sexual power and female treachery. It would be the Chicana poets and writers beginning in the 1970s who would first reassess and refute Malinche's negative biography. Frustrated by the misogyny of the Chicano movement, a movement of self-determination and liberation that largely left out women, many Chicanas saw themselves in the story of a woman caught between two worlds, as they were. Some Chicanas were also accused of being Malinches for challenging family and community expectations, in foregoing marriage or children, continuing their education, or dating non-Mexicans. These writers and scholars would be joined by Chicana visual artists in the early 1990s, who included Malinche in their efforts to counter the Columbus quincentenary celebration of a benign, quote, discovery and, quote, encounter of old and new worlds. The final gallery explores the many ways, oh, can you advance the slide for? There we go, thank you.
This one?
The final gallery, no, back, sorry. Yes, that one. The final gallery explores the many ways Chicana and Mexicana visual artists have reclaimed Malinche and her legacy. Some artworks lean into ancient modes of storytelling to retake the negative narratives and write Malinche into her story, while other artists elevate Malinche into a pantheon of Mexican feminine icons. As you can see here in the center, pieces that depict her with Guadalupe and the Virgen de Guadalupe. Next. Other Chicana artists re-envisioned Malinche as members of their community and family, such as this triptych by Annie Lopez, titled Sold as a Slave. It incorporates seemingly incongruent labels with 1940s photographs of female members of Lopez's family. With this juxtaposition, the piece questions whether anything has changed in the way that women are scrutinized by their appearances and or stigmatized by their decisions, as with Malinche. Lopez also reminds us that Malinche's story is our story. She's your mother, your sister, your aunt, she's you, she's us.
That last piece you can see really ushered the visitors into this visitor response area. This photograph was taken really early in the as part of our installation images, so it's not full. But I'll tell you, we had about 85,000 visitors come through Malinche in Denver, which was really a large number for us. We had never had that many people come to an exhibition, a Latin American exhibition. And I have to say that the responses that we received were so impactful. Some of them were heartbreaking. Some of them, I mean, I've never had such an emotional response in a project. It really felt like we were curating in community. We did a lot of outreach for this exhibition, and but we weren't sure how it was going to be received. And one of the things that we realized is that many of our visitors felt seen for the first time. You didn't have to be Latinx, you didn't have to be a woman. Many of the visitors who came through identified with the story of an individual who was marginalized in her own community and through history, whose own story had been yanked from her hands. And we are, as Tere mentioned at the beginning, we're really hoping that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end. So with that, I turn it over to our really fabulous panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Teresita Romo, Victoria Leal, this was brilliant. Thank you so much for taking us on this tour. And I'm very certain, at least myself, like I want to be in San Antonio. I'm sure like many people in the audience now with even more reason would like to in person witness the amazing work that you've done. So really heartily congratulations, felicitaciones for this wonderful effort. So we're gonna move now to our second part of this conversation, and I just wanna, before I continue, remind people that are watching us, following us via YouTube or via social media, that you can send us your questions or comments that you have. You can share with us via Twitter at Mexico Institute, or also sending it by email at mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So again, just it is my pleasure to be here and be the moderator for this section of our event. My name is Gemma Lopez Santamaria. I'm an assistant professor of Latin American history at George Washington University and also a global fellow at the Wilson Center with the Mexico Institute. I work on questions of violence, gender, and especially violence against women. So it is, of course, my great pleasure to be here. So what I would like to do is I'm gonna first ask our three panelists to answer some very specific questions that I have for them. I will ask them to give us brief responses around 3 to 5 minutes maximum each of you. And then we're gonna move to a more fluid conversation that will incorporate back Victoria and Teresita. So let me just briefly introduce you. If anyone in the audience wants to read more about their bios, it's all in the website of the Mexico Institute and of this Malinche event. But I would start with Dr. Camila Townsend, who is Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She's the author of numerous books of Indigenous history. And I would like to highlight, of course, for today's occasion, her book, Malinche's Choices, An Indian Woman in the Conquest of Mexico, that was published in 2006, which is an extraordinary book. And she also published recently Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, which I know is available in Spanish with grano de sal, and it's really amazing. Then we have Karen Cordero Rayman, who is an art historian, curator, and writer based in Mexico City since the mid-1980s. She has been a professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana and the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and was a founding member of Curare, a critical space for the arts and independent research center in Mexico City. And currently, among many other things, she is working as an independent researcher and curator, as well as on personal creative projects that relate art, literature, and history. And then we have the pleasure of having Sandy Rodriguez, who is a Los Angeles-based artist and researcher, and first generation Chicana raised on the US-Mexico border. Her Codex Rodriguez Mondragon is made up of a collection of maps and paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. And she has an incredible CV that I won't read, but again, you are invited to read more about our panelists in the website. So some initial questions. I mean, we have really, with this exhibit, an extraordinary opportunity to think about the presence and the historical reverberations of the influential story and figure of Malinche or La Malinche. And I really cannot think of any other figure, especially a woman, as Victoria was mentioning at the beginning, that holds such a central place in Mexican history and that pushes us really to rethink and imagine questions of gender, race, coloniality, and violence in modern, but also present day Mexico. So again, just to begin our conversation, I wanted to pose some specific questions for each one of you, drawing from your own work and your own encounters with La Malinche. So I will begin with Dr. Camila Townsend. So I wanted to ask you, so how does the story of Malinche that you have extensively researched and documented complicate or confirm our understanding of the role of women and gender relations during the conquest of Mexico and its aftermath?
That's a great question, Hema. I would say that Malinche's story really is a classic example of what Indigenous women risked as they lived their lives in pre-Columbian times, and certainly risked at the time of conquest. She was, as we have been saying, sold as a slave. She was taken in wartime and then made into a prisoner woman, a prisoner wife, and ended up amongst the Mayas. This was a very normal result of warfare. It was very typical in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and it was typical in ancient Mesoamerica. We do not know if she was literally grabbed in the midst of the battles that were occurring and the Aztecs had approached her people's country near the Coatzacoalcos region near today's Veracruz on the coast. And we do not know if she was taken prisoner then, literally in the middle of a battle, or if she was given with other women as a peace offering to try to stop a battle or prevent a battle. Either fate would have been very typical, and one or the other of those things happened to her. So she ended up getting sold by these Aztec merchants in Mayan country. There she lived as a sex slave and as someone who did domestic work, as did thousands upon thousands of Indigenous women who were taken in warfare. And again, this is not something unique to Native Americans. Around the globe in ancient times, women became prisoners during war, and then they were the ones who had to live with the consequences for the rest of their lives as prisoner wives. So it's a little bit absurd that we have over the generations come to think of her or other girls and young women like her as in some way selling themselves or betraying their people or sneaking around and taking advantage of their situation. They were brutalized concubines. And I think the more we have thought about this in recent times, and this exhibit is a great example, the more we have realized what we owe to their memory and how badly we have distorted it. I do want to say that it is true that there's in any stereotype, there's a kernel of truth, right? There's something there. And it is true that the Mesoamerican world was full of such women, and therefore it was full of people who had no real loyalty to the Aztecs. In every town and village, every altepet, there would have been numerous ones of these women. So even though Malinche was indispensable to Cortés, she translated, she guided, she helped them buy food, you know, she kept them alive and got them all the way to Moctezuma. Had she not existed, I think some other Spanish man would have found some other figure like Malinche. I think Cortés would have died, and we would not be speaking of him now. Malinche saved his butt, saved that expedition, okay, and made it possible for him to do what he did later in Tenochtitlan. But had she not existed and had he died, some other Spaniard would have come. They were leaving the Caribbean by the dozens. They were leaving Spain by the hundreds. And someone would have found some other very talented indigenous woman who had been made a slave, because that was part of their economy. So when we give her her due, the credit that she deserves for the brilliance and the savviness that she exhibited, we should not then make the mistake of following up by saying, so it was therefore her fault. She had the agency and therefore is responsible for what happened. She was caught in this violent set of circumstances, as were many other young women, and someone would have fulfilled that role. I think it makes more sense to focus on the attributes that the designers of the exhibit did focus on. That is the extraordinary courage that she exhibited, the ways in which we should try to remember her, to give her the due, the complexity that she exhibited. It wouldn't hurt to think also about the fact that those indigenous people who knew her in her life and wrote about her in their own language, I've read their words, and they tended to say, all but one said, she spent her capital trying to save our lives. She was trying to tamp down the situation and prevent some of the violence. So as long as we're complicating matters, I think it behooves us to remember that her real role may have been diametrically opposed to what the populace has chosen to remember her for. So she, in short, is a classic example of women's experiences, and yet as an individual put her own stamp on them too at the same time. I think I've exceeded my 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
No. That was fantastic, Camila, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues. I mean, I like especially how you're inviting us to, again, think about her agency. I mean, really, like what agency she had, like given the conditions that she was facing, but also helping us understand how extraordinary and at the same time like ordinary or compared to others was she. No, I mean, to understand her in her own time as well. So this is incredible. Let me continue the conversation and inviting Dr. Karen Cordero to join us. And Karen, I wanted to ask you, what is the presence and impact of Malinche in contemporary Mexican art? And how would you say that this art has changed the way in which we understand Malinche's life and legacy?
Well, thank you so much for this question, which actually relates closely to the essay which I wrote for the catalog of the exhibit. And thank you, Tere and Victoria, for this wonderful summary also of the exhibition, which I also hope to be able to see in San Antonio. So when I first began thinking about this aspect, when I became involved around 2018, I believe, as one of the many people who were involved in kind of an advisory group for this exhibit, and then in writing the essay, I really have to say that unlike Camila, who has been working on this subject for many years, or Tere, I really didn't know that much about Malinche's presence in contemporary Mexican art, and kind of had to look around and begin moving through my sources and trying to figure out how important Malinche was. Really the most prevalent presence, you could say, of a vision of Malinche in Mexican art is related more to works like the work by González Camarena or the calendar images, these kind of images of Cortez's compañera, and involved in this kind of romanticized also vision. But beginning to look a little more into how this Malinche is perceived from a perspective of art and gender, and particularly in the context of the feminist movement in Mexico since the 1970s and 80s, and even more so in the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years, with an increasing awareness of gender violence and increasing activism around gender violence, around the trafficking of women and children, and a number of other aspects. I found a number of works that take up in very interesting ways this and kind of resistance to the myth of Malinche. And I'm going to share my screen, I hope. Oops, I seem to have disappeared in my own PowerPoint. Here it is. Sorry, just to talk very, very briefly about a couple of those works. So one of the interesting things that I found is that a lot of the artists that took up the theme of Malinche and tried to break down and rework the narrative regarding her used their own bodies to counteract that myth. So here we have a work by performance artist and Maria Eugenia Chelet, who works a lot with stereotypes and myths and archetypes of women, using her own body imposed on the one hand on Orozco's mural of
Karen, we are not seeing the image.
Oh my God, really? Oh.
Yeah, we have not yet seen it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see then what I did. Sorry, let me see what I'm doing here. Okay. I'm sorry. Let's see. Oops, share screen. Maybe I shared it to myself and not to you. Okay. Here we are. Now it can be
Yes.
seen?
Yes,
Oh,
thank
sorry.
you, Karen.
Okay, sorry about that. So Maria Eugenia Chelet is, as I said, is a performance artist, so it's natural for her to use her own body as a way of counteracting or rethinking these stereotypes. And she does so on the one hand in this, oops, I think this has some timing thing on it, which is not functioning. And the other piece, which is it's a kind of diorama, it's part of an educational project. She becomes, on the other hand, this kind of romantic figure who is almost orientalizing, kind of fawning on Cortés. So she's kind of introducing herself into these various configurations of Malinche. And then we have another figure, a contemporary photographer and conceptual artist, Carol Espíndola, who is actually is from Puebla, but lives in Tlaxcala, which is, of course, the center of the Malinche myth. And she is reworking one of the oops, yeah, I think this has some timer thing on it. Sorry, the Malinche myth. It's keeping me on my time schedule, where she's inserting herself into one of the manuscripts of the time, but she's talking about her own body, and these are actually accompanied by a text where she talks about how she became aware of her own body as a child, and then became aware of how her body as a woman whose body was not conventionally related to Occidental beauty was perceived by others and associated kind of with this abundant sexuality just because of her physique. And this is a very interesting image. This work, as is the work of Carol Espíndola, are both in the exhibition. And this work is by Mercedes Gertz, who's a Mexican artist who's been living for a long time in Los Angeles. And here she takes up kind of two of the major archetypes or myths related to Malinche, and also to the Virgen de Guadalupe, kind of these two models of the ideal woman and the traitor, and puts them together and shows how women are not actually one of these, but situate themselves. And in this case, it's she uses her mother's wedding photo with her own face, and kind of these, the aura around her is made up by these legs, which allude to the kind of the vice and again, sexually seductive women. So she's also breaking apart this myth and inserting herself as a recipient, and one might say kind of a victim, or but also someone who is transforming this myth. And then we have a work by Dulce Maria Núñez. It's actually an earlier work from 1987 within the Neo-Mexican movement, which is a movement which is kind of taking up the heritage, one might say, of muralism in relation to the search for a Mexican identity, but relating it to contemporary concerns. So here she's kind of, the work is called filiación, which is a method of kind of registering your identity to the government. So here she's using various images, again, the very important mural of Cortés de Malinche, but here kind of cut apart as if they were identifying photographs, the image of a well-known boxer, things related to nature, both the nopal, but also the Iztaccíhuatl mountain, which is white woman, we could say. So she's putting together all these different symbolic elements to talk about how they are related to her own identity, and using kind of the seal to talk about how this is put into play in her own identity. And then we have the more cinematic and performance work, such as this work by Jesusa Rodriguez, which was already mentioned by Victoria and Tere. She has this very ironic performance piece, which she has done various versions of between the 1980s and the 1990s, where Malinche is a kind of television commentator telling the story of the context of the conquest, and is making this kind of very complex use of colloquial language, where she moves in time between the past and the present to talk about the corruption and the way that she kind of inserts herself and tries to not only survive, but also to use her linguistic power as a mediator in this process, but at the same time denouncing the different figures in the government and kind of transforming their names into kind of humorous and at the same time derogatory denominations. And I think I'm also running over my time, but finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this television series by Patricia Arriaga, which was just in 2018 and is an extraordinary reworking for a very public medium. It was put on Canal 11 and also produced by Bravo Films, where she turns into a series, The Life of Malinche, and puts Malinche at the center of the narrative of the conquest, and through a very imaginative script, and also a script which uses 4 different indigenous languages, tries to recreate precisely this very vulnerable situation of Malinche as a woman who is trying to survive in this very oppressive and violent environment in which she is taken into as a slave, as part of the trafficking of women that has already been mentioned. So those are just some of the ways in which this theme is present in contemporary Mexican art.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. And I have many questions, I'm sure the audience too, but it's interesting for us to reflect on how different the presence of Malinche has been in artistic production in Mexico and the United States, and how that reflects the different reception amongst different publics and audiences in these 2 countries. And also this art that you presented on the Guadinche also made me think of how productive it would be to think about the figures of La Virgen de Guadalupe and La Malinche in juxtaposition, I mean, as 2 figures of mestizaje, but clearly like very different, like meanings, interpretations, and appropriations. So very, very interesting. I'll turn over now to Sandy Rodriguez, who I know is also sharing some slides with us. And I wanted to ask you, Sandy, I mean, how has the figure of La Malinche allowed you and other artists to speak about violence against women across time and across borders? So if you could share with us some reflections on this.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for having me as part of the conversation. I just have a few minutes to really address the question and to take a look at about 9 slides that really illuminate a bit about the process. So my name is Sandy Rodriguez, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the figure of Malinche has really played into the opportunity to present visual narratives that address some of these cycles of violence. The map that you see in front of you, Mapa for Malinche and Our Stolen Sisters, is dedicated to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and their families from 2020. It is the 10th map. It is a commission for this exhibition, but it's part of a series called the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon. And it maps ongoing cycles of violence of communities of color by blending historic and contemporary events. The maps are made with hand-processed earth, plant, and insect-based watercolor onto a sacred and ceremonial, once outlawed paper called amate, a testament to the indigenous artistic traditions of the Americas. And it's through this recovery of medicinal and aesthetic uses of local plants and pigments that allows the work to provide a space for healing for us in this contemporary moment, but also for the building awareness of current and historic traumas. It's a very labor-intensive synthesis of interdisciplinary research, field study, historical and ethnobotanical research with the urgency of addressing the crisis along the US-Mexico border. This conversation began in 2018 when I had a studio visit with Victoria, Teresita, Matthew Robb, and Jesse here in Los Angeles. So it was 5 years ago that we began to discuss what it might look like to tell this story from her perspective. As you heard earlier from Victoria, this map makes visible Malinche's life story. I'm going to take just the next 2 minutes to carry you through how this becomes visible in this particular piece. I will say that the blue that you're looking at is conceptually encoded into this piece, and it is a Maya blue that connects us to ancestors. The gold on the edge of the map represents the gold sickness that afflicted the Spanish during the invasion. The red ochre all throughout the map is a ceremonial paint that records history and ritual. The cochinilla that you will see later in the piece is from a scale insect, and it stands in for blood. Some people say it's the only color that spirits can see. The white is for Malinche, our mother, our sister, our icon. Over 30 sketches have to be done in preparation for creating this map on amate, because amate is a very different type of paper, and it accepts the line once, and that's it. It is integrated into the fibers of the paper. But these 30 pieces were generated through weekly conversations with the very generous Victoria and Teresita on Zoom over the course of 2 years, figuring out how to make this narrative visible. Here you can see some of these smaller 8x10 images that are then very carefully mapped into the visual narrative to tell the story of her life and to bring the story full forward. Here you can see in the top left-hand corner a self-portrait of myself as a tlacuila, or a painter, scholar, scribe, witnessing and painting this view from Los Angeles. This was created amid the pandemic. I was unable to do the field study research that is part of my process to go to these sites. So I had the opportunity to really study a lot of the historic images. Those are the red hands that are the places of 19 other Indigenous women who were trafficked, murdered, or kidnapped, and were reported and recorded by MMIW USA. Here you see the cartouche that has those 8 moments that Victoria described for you earlier, so that contemporary artists could make the connection between the historic and then the contemporary. And the smaller details are numbered along the map for you to be able to unpack that. Here you have a closer detail where you can see the numbers for each one of those scenes. And each one of these is an interpretation from a historic source. It was months and months of reading and rereading and discussing the essays in the catalog, talking with my curators, and really having some difficult choices, but I'm very pleased with how this came out. There were some scenes that did not make it into the timeline, like this particular one, where you have a blending of multiple sources that weren't as critical in representing the narrative. So this was a decision that we made together to take the baptism scene out. Here you see where I pulled one element or two elements to create the visual representation in the final, but I'm doing a faithful kind of study of line, visual narrative, vocabulary, gesture, posture, expression, attributes, to understand where and how audiences at the time would understand it, and how we can extract those that we will be able to read with contemporary eyes. Same with this particular element where you see the historic sort on this side and where I've just pulled her out. And this is, again, a combination of 3 or 4 sources to try and figure out how to tell this narrative in a way that's legible and focused from her perspective. And here you have the same. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thanks so much.
Wow, this is incredible, Sandy. I want to continue seeing. I mean, as I said, like, I'm sure others in the audience feel the same, like this urgency to just enjoy and see these colors and this work, amazing work that you've done in person. So thank you very much for sharing. So I want to again remind, for those of you that are joining us via YouTube or following the event online, to please send us any questions or comments you have on the Twitter account of the Mexico Institute at Mexico Institute, or via email at mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So in these few minutes that we have left, we have around like 15 minutes or so left. I would like just to open the conversation for all of us. So the 3 panelists plus Victoria Leal and Teresita Romo on this great exhibit, and the meanings, the many meanings, the multiple meanings and appropriations of the story and life of La Malinche, and perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, and of course, feel free also to raise your hands or ask questions to each other. I want to do this as fluent as possible, but I mean, again, one of the things that is most impactful for me, I mean, as a Mexican that, you know, has been now in the US for quite a few years, is, I mean, to see how different the impact and meaning of La Malinche has been. I mean, for artists, for people, for feminists, for social movements. So how would you? I mean, how do you make sense of these like different interpretations or appropriations of La Malinche? I mean, what do we make of this seemingly, I would say, almost like marginal presence in Mexico, or up until recently, right? I mean, vis-a-vis what the I guess the Chicano movement could do in the US. I mean, about revisiting it. I mean, it's interesting that it seems that the critical impulse to revisit her story came from the United States. If you could share with us some thought on that. Anyone, just Karen.
Well, I wanted to mention, I think this is also a very interesting aspect. I think that in Mexico, there is this very, very strong nationalist tradition, and the kind of mythologization, I don't know if you would call it, around that process. Even though from a contemporary standpoint, there are many writers and thinkers who, of course, analyzed this process from a very critical point of view in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender violence. I think in popular culture, one might say, if we can use that word in any meaningful way, there is still this very kind of strong presence of this romantic vision of the conquest, and this and the importance also of the myth of mestizaje, as kind of at the root of that. So I think in some sense, even at a time where there is much more awareness of gender violence and also of more critical and complex views of the roles of indigenous culture, indigenous cultures, and the multiplicity of different indigenous cultures in society. It's still hard, I think, to find contexts in which there's even though the critical visions of this aspect have been very present in literature for many decades, and even in the visual arts, and in visual arts stemming from feminist culture. I think that their penetration of a broader public has been much more limited. And I think one of the ways we can see this is the fact that this the series that was done on Malinche by Patricia Arriaga, which is a very powerful series, I think it was extraordinary, was kind of repressed, you could say, even though the present government supposedly is very much in favor of a more predominant view of the importance of indigenous culture. This particular narrative, and with its focus, I think, on a vision of the story told from the perspective of a woman, was kind of disappeared. It wasn't supported to be given a more longer run or widespread audience, or to be shown on different platforms. So I think there's still a very powerful, well, I would say a very powerful patriarchal presence, but also a kind of unwillingness to let go of this kind of dominant narrative of the conquest. And in contrast to that, we can see that there was a series about the conquest with Cortés as the protagonist, which came up the following year and then was given much more publicity and has a much more kind of romanticizing point of view. So I think there's still a kind of different kind of investments, you might say, around that narrative of Malinche, and somehow the importance or the power of keeping her there as the traitor, having to have the bad person in this narrative. And of course, that person is a woman, and an indigenous woman. And of course, this can be seen in the context of the continuing very presence of feminicide and gender violence, the things that this panel deals with in Mexico.
Thank you, Karen. Victoria.
Yeah, I just wanted, kind of building on what Karen is saying. I just wanted to say, Gemma, that although yes, it's clear that a lot of the art that we featured uses Malinche in a critical way, right? To expose exactly what Karen is mentioning, that romantic nostalgia that still has such in some ways, a stranglehold, right? On Mexican culture on both sides of the border, right? So we had this Jesus Helguera calendar painting. So we had one of the original calendar paintings in the gallery. And as Tere mentioned when she described it, the reason that we included it was really to underscore these sexualized notions of Malinche, how that representation was engaging with exotifications that date back to the 18th century, right? Like the Indian female as a sexual object or an object of desire. But yet when the visitor stood in front of it, that's not what they saw. What they saw was an image that took them back. I mean, I can't tell you how many people said, I feel like I'm in the living room of my abuelita, like, oh my God, this takes me back, right? So it was this sort of like struggle for me to be like, yeah, I remember those too, but notice now, can you put on that critical lens? Can you look at that from this other perspective, right? And on the other hand, I did want to mention that even though this nostalgic glorification of that relationship between Cortés and Malinche still holds and still has some weight in popular culture, I went to Mexico in October, exactly a year ago, and was floored by the fact that the Templo Mayor had a didactic text that said, Was Malinche a traitor? No, period. O sea, punto final. That was really incredible. I don't think I would have seen that 10 years ago. You know, I think that we're making strides little by little. The proudest moment for me was when one of my colleagues said, you know what? I'm never using the word malinchista again. That was like, okay, job done. Okay.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thank you, Victoria. Teresita, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna jump in because I think what Victoria talked about in terms of nostalgia certainly plays the part of it. And obviously those calendars came to Mexico, as I described in my own personal experience. But I think during the Chicano movement, and I talked a little bit about it in the slide presentation, was that Chicanas found themselves being called Malinches. And so I think just from that viewpoint, being able to say, well, what does that mean and why? And then trying to unpack it. And then looking at it within the context of, well, who's calling me Malinche and why? And so I cited all the different reasons that, you know, that women were being, Chicanas specifically, were being called Malinches. And it's interesting that when you read the early writings, the Chicanas trace their beginnings in terms of being Chicanas back to the pre-conquest time. And whereas if you read Chicano critical literature or history, they talk about 1848, you know, the Mexican-American War, when, you know, the idea of the border crossed us, we didn't cross the border, and all of that history. So I think it's interesting when you see it that Chicanas then go back farther. So there's that. And of course, Malinche is part of that history, not, you know, 1848. And I think specifically what I talked about, when you read a lot of the critical writing, and especially the poetry, which we included in the catalog, because we wanted people to read about it, to be able to experience that time period, to look at how they saw themselves in Malinche. That, you know, that they were in the middle because they were part of two different cultures, and that they were in the middle in terms of expectations of, you know, making it, and then also being held back by certain cultural expectations on the part of families. And I think all of that feeds into, here's a woman that they can identify with. Here's someone who's going through a lot of different experiences, challenges, and yet is being blamed, just like they were, like I said, for different reasons. And so then seeing themselves, they felt, no, we need to write our own narratives, and we need to complicate that history that we've given her. So I think that is a big part of what happens in the Chicano movement. And then, as I expressed it, it's the visual artists in 1991, 92, who look at the quincentenary and say, okay, you know, then you start seeing the visual representations of Malinche within the context of the encounter and, you know, this idea of a sanitized version of the invasion, and how Columbus was a part of that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Teresita. I think this is an important dimension to understand how her figure was reimagined, and really pushes us to rethink her place and the importance it has to reimagine the questions of patriarchy, colonial domination, agency. I mean, one of the things that I mean, you are all making me think about how also the figure of La Malinche connects to the question of femicides, and how femicides and victims of femicides get talked about in the press and in popular representations when they are re-victimized, no? Because somehow they are thought about as women that were, you know, living a life outside of the domains of domesticity, motherly care, or you know, within the gender expectations for them. No, I mean, if we think about the femicides in Ciudad Juárez, no, I mean, how women were presented as being malas mujeres, no, I mean, and somehow deserving that violence. So all these betrayals, no, I mean, the question of betrayal and how betrayals to sexual, racial, and otherwise gender expectations, you know, contribute to these narratives of re-victimization. So, I mean, one of the things, we have like very few minutes, but just kind of like opening up, if you could, any of you wants to share like some last thoughts on how mean, why is it that the story of La Malinche help us rethink these questions of patriarchy and agency? I mean, what is it about her? No, I mean, what is it about her that makes it so powerful? Still, no, I mean, Camila, like from her history and her presence in changing history, changing presence in the historiography up until today with the works of artists such as Sandy Rodriguez. What is it about her? If you can, like one last thought from any of you or all of you.
I think it does matter that for a brief period, she was the most powerful person in the hemisphere. I mean, it wasn't Moctezuma, it wasn't Cortez. Neither one of them could really manejar, sort of manage the situation, negotiate the situation without her agency, without her knowledge, her linguistic abilities, her savviness, her cleverness. And because no one has access, there's no written record, we don't know her innermost thoughts. And because people have long loved to vilify women and project onto women, the stage was set for what indeed happened, for all sorts of different people, different cultures and subcultures and groups of people to imagine things about her and make assertions about her that mostly weren't true. Had she not been so powerful and important in the first place, there wouldn't have been these reverberations. Had she been a European man who wrote, and we have all sorts of letters and statements, it would not have been as easy to project upon her. But given that she did matter so much, and there is a silence at the heart of the story, and then combine that with sexism and projections onto young women, we have the recipes for what happened. She becomes this extraordinary polarizing figure. We can find other figures like that in modern times too, that matter a great deal in terms of some political event, but we know little about them, so everybody has an opinion. And she's somewhat a classic example of that phenomenon too. I think she would laugh if she could only have known how much time and energy would be spent over the succeeding centuries, imagining what she thought about.
Well, and I would say much like what Camilla is pointing to, because she served as a mirror, because she's been this canvas on which so many different projections over history have been manifested. I think for our visitors, what we saw is that by being able to see the way that this individual's history and story was twisted and manipulated, and all of the different layers of racism and discrimination and expectations have been layered onto this one person and their one history, our visitors were able to see how that manifests in their own lives. And so we had a number of different women wrote to me to tell me that that through this show, they had conversations with their family about some of the expectations that they grew up with, and really trying to dismantle some of those layers about what it means to be a modern woman today. Do they want a family? Do they not want a family? What color is their hair? What are they expected to look like? It was an incredible experience to just see how this exhibition, by exploring this history, allowed young women today, especially Latinas, to really re-examine their own history and what they grew up with.
Karen.
Yes, I think just taking up what both Camila and Victoria have talked about, I think the fact that Malinche doesn't have a voice, and at the same time, her voice and language were her power, this enormous power that Camila talked about. I think this does kind of set the stage, as Victoria mentioned, for everybody putting a face and a voice on her. And I think this highlights kind of the importance, really, our consciousness of both language and the body as the ways in which we are identified and pigeonholed, but at the same time, the places from which we can take power, revert stereotypes, and articulate our own experience. And how also I think one of the interesting things about Patricia Arriaga's film was this multilingual characteristic and the kind of putting the public in the place of not understanding, to sort of put you in that situation where you hear voices but can't participate directly in the dialect, to understand the importance of the voice and of languages as places in which power is taken. And of course, in the exhibition, it's also very clear how representation also takes that role. And the representation is a way of putting yourself on the map, putting yourself in space. But I think even more than that, the importance of language and it has to do with also the importance of Malinche in so much literature and rewriting the narrative and rewriting it again, and the importance of that still for our time, and all these problematics of the body and of language as central to our current dilemmas.
Thank you, Karen. We have only 5 minutes left, but Sandy and Teresita, if you would like 1 minute, say something, please.
I just wanted to share that it was an extraordinary moment to really discuss all of these issues over the past few years, when really thinking about what it means to tell her story in the 500-year anniversary of the Conquista, and what it means to be able to explain how the hell we got here in terms of these record numbers of femicide on both sides of the border. Just from 2015 to 2021, there was a 150% increase in the murder and the missing Indigenous women on both sides of the border. And when you get into the statistics, this is not a new story. This is an urgent story that nobody is talking about, that we have an opportunity to shine a spotlight and say, one of the first most visible stories was the story of Malinche. And we have not had the opportunity to discuss this in public spaces, the ways in which this exhibition has allowed us to. In the exhibition label, we were able to include a map that we created in My Google Maps of those women who were trafficked and stolen from various locations. And I'll tell you that some of the visitors at the Denver Art Museum installation came up to me and explained how much it impacted them to open that QR code and to see these places close to home where these atrocities have happened and continue to happen. So it is just an honor to be able to share this conversation with you all.
Thank you. Teresita, 1 minute.
I was going to say, I think if nothing else, her relevance was really brought to my attention when I think it was like a year or two before, when the LA Times ran a story about how the sheriff, Villanueva, a Latino, who called one of the Board of Supervisors, Hilda Solis, a Malinche, because she was bringing him, basically telling him that he needed to be accountable for the death of a young man who was unarmed. And to me, that brought it back full circle, because, here is this person, this sheriff person, even though the Hilda is the Board of Supervisors, so technically over him, but he feels empowered to cast this as a slur against a Board of Supervisor. She kind of, here we are in, 2021 or whatever the year was, very recent. So to me, it's like, that's why it's so important.
Thank you so much, Teresita, for that. And with that note, I want to again thank you everyone for your amazing contribution. Thank you, Victoria, Teresita, for giving us this gift to bring back La Malinche and to put her in conversation with the tragedies that we're living today, but also with the opportunities that we have as women to transform these realities today on both sides of the border. So thank you once again, and everybody that joined us. It was my pleasure to meet you all. And again, an invitation to everyone out there, go and see this amazing exhibit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.